My daughter-in-law called to tell me my son was dead before the police even found his car. The next morning, I fired our family attorney and hired 3 private investigators. If you're watching this, subscribe and let me know where you're watching from. The official story was textbook perfect. Michael's car broke down on a frozen road in Utah, somewhere near a forest, buried in snow. Heavy snowfall, they said, the kind of weather that makes search and rescue teams shake their heads and mention spring thaws. They found the car the next day, abandoned with doors locked. No footprints thanks to the blizzard, no signs of struggle, nothing inside except Michael's wallet and phone, positioned like props in a carefully staged scene. The police spent exactly 1 week looking, 7 days of trudging through snow, calling his name into empty woods, and filing reports that concluded absolutely nothing. Meanwhile, Sabrina stayed home, delivering an Oscar-worthy performance as the devastated wife. I sat in their kitchen that first evening, watching her dab her eyes while scrolling through her phone. Real grief doesn't pause for social media updates, but Sabrina seemed to be managing both simultaneously. "The memorial should be small," she whispered, voice breaking at precisely the right moments. "Michael would have wanted something private." Private. Of course. Convenient how the dead always prefer small, intimate affairs. "What about continuing the search?" I asked. "They haven't found—" "Mom," she interrupted, tears drying with remarkable speed. "We need to accept reality. Michael is gone. The sooner we face that, the sooner we can begin healing." Healing. She used that word constantly over the following days, like grief was a bruised knee requiring only time and band-aids. By the second week, Sabrina had shifted into high gear. While I was posting missing person flyers around town, she was posting job listings for Michael's position at Monroe Innovations. While I fielded calls from search teams, she fielded calls from probate attorneys. "We can't let the company suffer because of personal tragedy," she explained when I discovered her in Michael's office, sorting through confidential files. He would have wanted business continuity. Amazing how clearly she understood a dead man's corporate philosophy. Her father, Richard, materialized on Tuesday, playing the supportive in-law role with all the subtlety of community theater. He brought casseroles and condolences, but I caught him photographing Michael's contracts when he thought nobody was watching. The memorial service was appropriately intimate. Sabrina wore designer black that cost more than most people's monthly salary. She sobbed beautifully into Richard's shoulder while I stood there in my practical navy dress, observing the performance. "He was so young," someone whispered behind me. "Such a terrible tragedy," another voice agreed. I wanted to laugh, or maybe scream. After the service, I helped clear away the lilies and sympathy casseroles. Sabrina and Richard huddled in the corner, discussing transition strategies and administrative requirements in voices they thought were private. A week later, Sabrina walked into the county courthouse with a briefcase full of paperwork and a family attorney I'd never seen before. Death certificate application, presumptive death declaration, emergency corporate succession documents that she claimed Michael had signed months earlier. "Standard business continuity planning," the attorney explained to anyone who asked. "Mr. Monroe was very thorough about ensuring smooth operations in case of emergency." Funny how thorough my son had apparently been about his own demise. The legal process took 3 weeks, but Sabrina had prepared well. Corporate bylaws mysteriously supported her temporary assumption of control. Board members who might have objected received calls from Richard's business associates, suggesting that cooperation would be in everyone's best interest. Within a month, Sabrina was officially interim CEO, while a search for permanent leadership took place. The search apparently was expected to take several years. "She barely waited for the body to cool," I muttered while loading my dishwasher that evening, though I was beginning to suspect there never was one. But watching Sabrina navigate the legal system with such precision made me realize something important. This wasn't opportunistic. This was orchestrated. And orchestrated meant planned. And planned meant I was dealing with something much more dangerous than simple greed. At 65 years old, I was apparently invisible to everyone in that room. They looked at me and saw a grieving mother who'd gratefully accept their help managing complicated matters. They were about to discover how spectacularly wrong they were. Sabrina's media interviews were masterworks of calculated emotion. Channel 7, Channel 12, even that morning show nobody admits to watching. She occupied Michael's favorite chair, dabbing her eyes while Richard stood behind her projecting paternal gravitas. "Michael was passionate about Monroe Innovations," she told the reporter, voice catching with practiced precision. I know he'd want me to preserve his vision. His vision. Apparently, Michael's vision involved his wife assuming control as co-CEO within 72 hours of his presumptive death certificate. I watched from my kitchen, coffee growing cold, as my daughter-in-law explained how she'd be temporarily stepping into Michael's role while they searched for permanent solutions. Richard nodded sagely, already positioned as the family consultant who'd guide her through these treacherous waters. The treacherous waters of monetizing my son's disappearance, apparently. 3 days after we buried an empty coffin, I drove to Monroe Innovations to collect Michael's personal items. What I discovered was Sabrina and Richard in Michael's conference room, surrounded by enough documentation to clear-cut a small forest. "Elizabeth!" Sabrina jumped up, hastily organizing papers into neat stacks. "I wasn't expecting you today." "I wanted Michael's things," I said, scanning the documents. "Corporate restructuring forms, insurance claims, emergency succession protocols. Unless you need his coffee mug for business purposes." Richard cleared his throat diplomatically. "We're ensuring legal compliance. Very tedious administrative stuff." Tedious. Apparently hostile takeovers had been reclassified as paperwork management. The next day, I attempted reasoning with Detective Morrison. He demonstrated the sympathy without usefulness combination that seemed to be his professional specialty. "Mrs. Monroe, I understand your concerns, but there's no evidence of criminal activity. Sometimes people simply vanish, especially in severe weather conditions. And sometimes wives benefit remarkably well from convenient vanishings," I replied. He gave me that look, the universal police expression for hysterical, grieving mother. "I know this is difficult, but you need to trust us to handle the investigation. If circumstances change, we'll contact you immediately." If circumstances change. As if missing sons regularly send postcards from beyond. I departed the police station and drove directly to Monroe Innovations. The parking lot bustled with activity, business humming along as though nothing catastrophic had occurred. Through the lobby windows, I observed Sabrina in Michael's office, occupying his chair like she'd been born to it. Jessica, the receptionist, looked confused when she spotted me. "Mrs. Monroe, I'm so sorry for your loss. Are you here to see Mrs. Monroe?" "Mrs. Monroe?" Apparently there were two of us now. "Just collecting some items," I lied smoothly. I rode the elevator to the 3rd floor and walked corridors where my son had spent 5 years building something meaningful. The walls displayed photos from company events, team retreats, client celebrations. Michael appeared in most of them, smiling and confident and undeniably alive. The irony was suffocating. Here I stood, surrounded by evidence of my supposedly deceased son, while his widow sat upstairs spending his life insurance payout on new office furniture. Angela, Michael's assistant, found me in the break room staring at a motivational poster about persistence. "Mrs. Monroe, I thought that was you." She embraced me with vanilla perfume and genuine sadness. "I still can't believe he's gone." "Neither can I said, meaning it more literally than she realized. "Is there anything I can do?" "I saved his personal belongings in a box." "Actually, there might be something." I lowered my voice conspiratorially. "Have you noticed anything unusual since the accident?" Angela glanced around nervously. "Unusual how?" "Documents being relocated, files being accessed, that sort of thing." She hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Tyler mentioned something about Mr. Michael's computer files being reorganized. Said it was strange because Sabrina ordered it done immediately after the memorial." Tyler. The intern who spilled coffee on everything, but somehow noticed important details. "What kind of files?" "Financial records mostly. Contracts, client databases, everything you'd need if you were—" She stopped, looking uncomfortable. "If you were assuming someone's position," I finished. Angela nodded grimly. I patted her arm reassuringly. "Thank you, dear. And Angela, keep listening. For Michael." Walking back to my car, I passed Sabrina's new Mercedes, occupying the executive parking space. Michael's space, the spot he'd earned through 16-hour days and treating every client like family. I stood there momentarily, keys in hand, staring at that gleaming black vehicle where my son's modest Honda used to sit. My son vanished in a scene from a thriller novel, I told my car keys, and the villains were already rehearsing their victory speech. But every compelling story needs an unexpected twist, and I was just beginning to write mine. The predator had circled long enough. Time to discover what these scavengers were really made of. Playing the role of accepting mother-in-law proved surprisingly effortless. Grief apparently renders people harmless, in others' estimation. I began visiting Sabrina's house with homemade cookies and carefully orchestrated conversations. "I've been reflecting," I said, over tea and deception, about how proud Michael would be, seeing you take leadership like this. Sabrina produced that practiced smile she'd perfected for the cameras. I simply want to honor his legacy. Honor. Nothing honors a man's legacy quite like systematically erasing him from his own company. I spent 2 weeks mastering the grateful mother-in-law role, delivering dinners, volunteering to assist with paperwork, listening to Sabrina explain how she was learning the ropes while Richard provided family guidance. The performance was exhausting, but yielded valuable intelligence. Tyler seems remarkably capable, I mentioned casually, while helping Sabrina organize Michael's home office. Michael always praised his initiative. Oh yes, Tyler's been invaluable during this transition. He's been systematically reorganizing Michael's files, ensuring proper documentation. Systematically reorganizing. Such a useful euphemism. That must involve considerable work. All those contracts and client records. You have no idea. There were so many loose ends. Michael wasn't always the most organized person. Michael, the man who color-coded his sock drawer and alphabetized his spice collection, disorganized. I nodded sympathetically while mentally cataloging every revelation. Angela became an unexpected intelligence source, texting subtle observations that might prove significant later. Sabrina had Tyler extract all Monroe account files, read one message. Claims she needs to review the portfolio. Another. Richard spent 3 hours in Michael's office accessing the safe, photographed everything inside. The safe. Michael's private safe that supposedly only family knew about. By the 3rd week, I had sufficient breadcrumbs to follow a trail. Richard's consulting firm had mysteriously acquired several new clients, all former Monroe Innovation accounts. Sabrina had quietly transferred major contracts to subsidiary companies that hadn't existed 3 months earlier. Then came the invitation. Elizabeth, I'd love your presence at our company celebration next week, Sabrina said, voice bright with artificial warmth. It's important that staff see us moving forward together. Moving forward. Another favorite phrase in her vocabulary. What exactly are we celebrating? I inquired. New partnerships, fresh directions, the kind of growth Michael always envisioned. The kind of growth requiring his convenient absence, apparently. I accepted the invitation with the enthusiasm of someone with nothing remaining to lose, because that's precisely what they believed I was. A harmless widow, collecting sympathy casseroles and family photographs. They were about to discover their fundamental miscalculation. The evening before the party, I sat in my kitchen with wine and a legal pad covered in notes. Names, dates, connections. The foundation of a pattern that would transform my son's disappearance from apparent misfortune into obvious malice. Angela had confirmed that multiple stock transfers had been processed through shell corporations. Tyler had mentioned casually that some of Michael's computer files showed access logs dated after his supposed death. Richard's consulting contracts all involved clients who'd previously worked exclusively with Monroe Innovations. I finished my wine and smiled at my reflection in the kitchen window. Tomorrow, I'd smile and nod and perform the grateful family member while Sabrina and Richard celebrated their good fortune. But tonight, I was planning something different. Something that would remind them that underestimating Elizabeth Monroe was their first mistake. And if they were smart, they'd make sure it was also their last. The performance was almost over. Time to see what these vultures looked like when the tables turned. I had the distinct feeling Michael would approve of what came next. I discovered the flash drive by accident, which is how most important revelations occur. While packing Michael's home office, boxing books and papers that Sabrina hadn't yet reorganized, one accounting textbook felt suspiciously heavy. The pages had been precisely cut to create a hiding space. Very spy novel. Very Michael. He'd always been dramatic about security protocols. The flash drive was small and unmarked, concealed inside what used to be corporate asset management. The irony wasn't lost on me. I brought it home and inserted it into my laptop with the nervous energy that accompanies potentially discovering either crucial answers or computer viruses. What I found exceeded my worst expectations. The file was a video, dated 3 weeks before Michael's disappearance. He sat in his home office, the same office where I'd found the drive. He looked exhausted, beyond exhausted, haunted. "Mom," he said, staring directly into the camera, "if you're watching this, it means they succeeded." My coffee went cold as I listened to my son explain how his wife and father-in-law had been using Monroe Innovations to launder money for what he termed extremely dangerous organizations. It started small, Michael continued, running his hands through his hair in that gesture he'd used since childhood. Consulting contracts that made no sense, payments to companies that apparently didn't exist. Sabrina claimed Richard was expanding our network. He looked utterly drained as he described asking questions. Richard becoming defensive, Sabrina working late, taking calls in separate rooms, behaving like a stranger. I traced some of the money, Mom. It connects to organizations that make organized crime look like a book club. When I told Sabrina I was contacting the FBI, he paused, took a breath. She said I'd regret that decision. That some secrets are too dangerous to reveal. The video lasted 23 minutes. 23 minutes of my son explaining how the two people he trusted most had threatened to destroy him if he didn't cooperate. I attempted to cancel the Dalmore Logistics contract. That's when things became genuinely frightening. Richard appeared at my office with two associates who looked like they bench-pressed automobiles for recreation, said I was being reckless, said intelligent people don't ask questions about certain business relationships. Dalmore Logistics. I wrote the name down, along with every other detail Michael mentioned. I'm recording this because I can't trust anyone anymore. Not the police. Richard claims he has contacts in law enforcement. Not our attorneys. They've been working with Richard for months. Only you, Mom. You're the only person who knew me before this nightmare began. Near the end, Michael's expression grew more intense. I've created something like insurance, a backdoor into our systems that only I know about. If something happens to me, those access codes are hidden in my copy of Advanced Financial Planning, the one with the torn cover. The system will stay dormant unless activated with those codes. He paused, looking directly at the camera. I also gave Earl Hutchins a sealed envelope to hold. He doesn't know what's in it, but he knows to give it to you if I disappear. Inside are account numbers, contact information for two of Richard's associates who might be willing to talk, and the location of financial records I've been copying. This explained how Earl had known about Dalmore Logistics. Michael had been preparing for this. If they kill me, make them pay, all of them. And Mom, don't trust anyone, not until you're absolutely certain whose side they're on. I sat in my kitchen for over an hour after the video ended, staring at my laptop screen and processing what I'd learned. My daughter-in-law wasn't merely a gold-digging opportunist. She was part of something significantly larger and infinitely more dangerous. And my son was either dead or hiding from people who specialized in making inconvenient individuals disappear permanently. I poured myself a substantial glass of wine and began making lists. Names from the video, companies Michael had mentioned, dates that might prove significant. The memorial service suddenly made perfect sense. Sabrina hadn't been grieving. She'd been celebrating. The rapid assumption of Michael's death wasn't wishful thinking. It was the preferred outcome. I thought about all those sympathetic calls I'd received. All those people offering support while my daughter-in-law liquidated my son's life insurance and restructured his company according to her specifications. The flash drive felt warm in my hand as I ejected it. Such a small object to contain such devastating truth. I returned it to the hollowed textbook and placed both in my safe next to my will and Michael's birth certificate. Evidence for later, when I determined what later was going to look like. For now, I had names to research and lies to uncover. The performance of grateful mother-in-law would continue, but now it served a purpose beyond simple reconnaissance. Michael had asked me to make them pay. I intended to honor that request with compound interest. The advantage of being an invisible 65-year-old woman is that people assume you don't comprehend complicated concepts like corporate fraud and money laundering. They're usually correct, but I'd spent 40 years married to a man who built his business from nothing. I understood enough to follow the breadcrumbs Michael had left behind. Dalmore Logistics proved fascinating upon investigation. Officially, they were a Nevada-based shipping and receiving company. In reality, they operated as a financial washing machine with an extremely selective client roster. I spent 3 days at the public library using their computers to research the companies Michael had mentioned. Amazing what you can discover when you know what to seek and have unlimited time. Cross-referencing contracts with incorporation dates told a compelling story. Most of Monroe Innovation's new partners had been created within weeks of each other, all sharing the same registered agent, all using business addresses that proved to be mailbox stores. The security guard Michael mentioned in his video was surprisingly easy to locate. Earl Hutchins, 43 years old, terminated from Monroe Innovations 2 days after Michael's disappearance for violations of company policy. No explanation, no severance, simply gone. I found his address through the most sophisticated investigative technique known to humanity, the telephone directory. Earl lived in a duplex on the east side of town, the kind of neighborhood where residents minded their own business and asked minimal questions, perfect for someone who might have secrets to protect. I knocked on his door at 2 in the afternoon, wearing my most harmless elderly lady ensemble and carrying a plate of cookies. Earl answered looking exactly like a man who'd been fired for knowing too much. "Mr. Hutchins? I'm Elizabeth Monroe. I believe you knew my son Michael." His face cycled through several interesting expressions before settling on carefully neutral. "I'm sorry for your loss, ma'am. Michael was a good guy." "Was." "Yes, everyone uses past tense." I extended the cookies. "I was hoping you might share some stories about his final weeks at work, before the accident." Earl hesitated, glancing over my shoulder as though expecting unwelcome company. "I don't know what I could tell you that you don't already know. You'd be surprised how little people tell the grieving mother." I produced my most innocent smile. "Sometimes the people who worked closest with him have the most meaningful memories." He admitted me reluctantly, but kept checking the windows like he anticipated unwelcome visitors. "Michael seemed stressed those last few weeks," he admitted, pouring coffee that could have removed paint. "Staying late, making numerous calls, asking questions about security protocols." "What sort of questions?" Earl's expression grew more guarded. "About who had access to what. About whether our systems could be compromised externally. About whether someone could monitor his communications." "Did you tell him they could?" I told him what I knew, which wasn't extensive, but it was enough to make him nervous. I sipped the terrible coffee and watched Earl's face as I casually mentioned Dalmore Logistics. He went pale. "Where did you hear that name?" "Michael mentioned it once. Said something about canceling a contract with them." Earl set down his coffee cup with hands that weren't entirely steady. "Mrs. Monroe, you seem like a nice lady. Take my advice and forget about Dalmore. Forget about whatever Michael might have told you. Some things are better left buried." Interesting choice of words. He stood abruptly. "I think you should leave." "Did they pay you to forget, Earl? Or just threaten you?" His silence provided sufficient answer. I left the cookies and my business card on his coffee table. "If you reconsider talking, you know how to reach me." Walking back to my car, I noticed a black sedan parked across the street that hadn't been there upon my arrival. The driver was reading a newspaper in that particular way people read newspapers when they're not actually reading. I drove home slowly, monitoring my mirrors. The sedan followed for 6 blocks before turning away, but the message was unmistakable. Someone was tracking who asked questions about Michael Monroe. That evening, I sat in my kitchen with wine and a new understanding of Earl's terrified reaction to Dalmore Logistics. A man doesn't look that frightened over a simple shipping company. Whatever Michael had stumbled upon was significant enough to make grown men vanish and scary enough to make security guards afraid of their own shadows. I pulled out Michael's torn copy of Advanced Financial Planning and found what he'd hidden there. A piece of paper with a series of numbers and letters, access codes. Looking at those codes, I realized Michael had given me more than evidence of their crimes. He'd given me a way to watch them commit new ones. "I didn't have proof yet," I said to my wine glass. But Earl's silence spoke louder than any confession. The web was larger than I'd imagined, which meant dismantling it would require more than cookies and casual questions. Time to get serious about bringing my son home. Angela called me at 7 in the morning, which meant either someone was dead or something was very wrong. In my experience, those weren't mutually exclusive possibilities. "Mrs. Monroe, you need to hear this," she whispered into the phone. "Someone accessed Mr. Michael's computer files last night." I sat up in bed, instantly alert. "What kind of files?" "Everything. Financial records, client databases, even his personal folders." But here's the strange part. They used a maintenance backdoor that IT says was installed months before Mr. Michael disappeared. A backdoor that should have been discovered and closed by now. Who else knew about this backdoor? That's just it. It says it was hidden so well they only found it because someone was actively using it, like whoever created it designed it to be nearly invisible, unless you knew exactly where to look. I was dressing before she finished talking. "Angela, I need you to check something for me. Can you determine what IP address accessed those files?" "Already did. It originated from a public library in Denver. Someone who knew how to cover their tracks, but wanted us to know they were there." "Denver. Close enough to be local, far enough to maintain distance." I met Angela at a coffee shop 3 blocks from Monroe Innovations. She looked nervous, which made 2 of us. "This is going to sound crazy," she said, sliding a printed report across the table. "But what if Mr. Michael set this up before he disappeared? Like insurance?" It didn't sound crazy at all. It sounded exactly like something my paranoid son would do. The access patterns are too specific, she continued. Whoever got into those files knew exactly what they were looking for. They pulled contracts from the past 6 months, financial projections, and all the correspondence with those shell companies you asked me about. And they used a backdoor that only Michael would have known about. A backdoor that took IT specialists 2 years to find. Even when they knew someone was using it, I studied the report, pieces clicking into place. Someone with Michael's technical knowledge, accessing exactly the information that would damage Sabrina and Richard. Angela, I need you to do something that might get you fired. She leaned forward. What do you need? I want you to send an email to Michael's personal account. The one he used for family correspondence, not business. What should I say? I thought carefully. Tell him his mother has been asking questions about the family business, and that someone's been watching the same files she's interested in. Angela nodded, understanding the subtext. If Michael was out there, he'd know I'd found his evidence. If someone else was using his back door, they'd know they weren't alone in investigating. 3 days later, I received my answer. The email came from a generic account with a random string of numbers. No sender name, no signature, just 4 words that made my heart race. The dead remember everything. I stared at those words for 20 minutes, reading them repeatedly until they burned into my memory. Was this Michael? Was this someone using his investigation? Was this a threat or a promise? I wanted to respond immediately, to flood the anonymous account with questions and demands and confusion. Instead, I closed my laptop and walked around my house several times, thinking, if Michael was alive and hiding, there was a reason he couldn't contact me directly. If someone else was using his research, they might be just as dangerous as the people we were investigating. But if Michael was truly dead, then someone else knew about Sabrina and Richard's crimes. Someone who had access to his passwords and his investigation. That evening, I sat in my kitchen with wine and a new understanding of my situation. I wasn't just investigating corporate fraud. I was dealing with people who'd driven my son into exile or death and stolen his life while pretending to mourn. The anonymous email changed everything. I was no longer operating alone, but I had no idea if my unseen ally was friend or enemy. I composed a careful reply to the anonymous account. The living don't forget either. Some stories demand to be told. I hit send before I could second-guess myself. If Michael was watching, he'd know I was ready to fight. If someone else was involved, they'd know I wasn't backing down. Either my son was alive and hiding, I said to my reflection in the kitchen window, or someone else wanted Sabrina and Richard to pay for their crimes just as much as I did. But ghosts don't send emails. Only the living need justice. Time to discover who was really pulling the strings. 3 years. 3 years of watching Sabrina perform the grieving widow while constructing an empire on my son's supposed grave. 3 years of Richard's sympathetic phone calls and helpful business guidance. 3 years of memorial dinners and anniversary remembrances and touching speeches about Michael's legacy. Tonight, the performance ended. The annual Monroe Family Charity Gala was Sabrina's concept, naturally. A way to honor Michael's memory while supporting causes he cared about. Translation: a method to celebrate her success while appearing philanthropic for the cameras. I spent 2 hours preparing, selecting my outfit like armor for battle. Black dress, pearls worth more than most people's cars, and the diamond earrings Michael had given me for my 60th birthday. If this was going to be theater, I intended to dress the part. The ballroom resembled a wedding reception, all white roses and twinkling lights. Sabrina had spared no expense on what amounted to a 3-year victory celebration. Elizabeth, she swept toward me in a gown that probably cost more than my mortgage payment. You look absolutely stunning. Michael would be so proud. I'm certain he would, I replied, air kissing her cheek like we were dear friends instead of mortal enemies. Richard worked the room like a seasoned politician, shaking hands and accepting condolences for a tragedy that had made him wealthy. He'd gained weight over the past 3 years. Success apparently agreed with his appetite. I found my assigned seat near the front, surrounded by business associates and community leaders who'd known Michael since childhood. They offered the usual sympathetic murmurs about time-healing wounds and Michael's memory living on. If only they knew how literally accurate that was about to become. Sabrina took the stage at 8:30, precisely on schedule. She delivered a speech about resilience and honoring the past while building the future, about how Michael's vision continued through every success Monroe Innovations achieved. Tonight, we celebrate not just what was, but what endures, she said, raising her champagne glass. To Michael, who taught us that family means never abandoning each other. The irony was so dense you could cut it with industrial equipment. That's when I noticed him. He was standing near the back entrance, partially hidden by the serving staff entrance. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. Grief does that sometimes. But as the crowd shifted, I saw him more clearly. Michael, thinner, older, with a beard that changed his whole face and a scar on his left cheek that hadn't been there before. He was wearing a server's uniform, blending in with the catering staff. Our eyes met across the crowded ballroom, and he shook his head slightly. Not yet. He moved through the crowd like he belonged there, invisible to everyone except me. I watched him position devices near the stage, recording equipment. I realized he was documenting everything. When Sabrina finished her speech and raised her champagne glass, I saw him touch his ear. He was wearing some kind of communication device. Then I understood. This wasn't impulse. This was coordination. "Sorry to interrupt," he said, stepping forward just as Sabrina proposed her toast. "But I think there's been a mistake." The timing was perfect. Every phone in the room was already recording Sabrina's speech. Now they'd capture Michael's resurrection too. Sabrina turned toward his voice, confused at first. Then recognition hit her like a physical blow. Her champagne glass slipped from her fingers and shattered against the stage. "Hello, darling," Michael said, stepping closer but keeping his distance. Smart. Too many witnesses for violence, but close enough for the cameras. "Miss me?" The crowd began to murmur, confusion spreading through the ballroom. Some people recognized him, others thought they were witnessing some kind of performance. Richard had gone completely white, gripping his table as if the earth was shifting beneath his feet. "You look surprised," Michael continued, addressing Richard now. "Did you think I wouldn't find my way home eventually?" I realized what he was doing. Every word was being recorded by dozens of phones. Every reaction from Sabrina and Richard was being captured. This wasn't just a dramatic reveal. It was evidence gathering in real time. The silence stretched another heartbeat before the room exploded into chaos. Cameras flashing, people shouting, security guards looking confused about whether they should arrest a dead man or the people who'd stolen his life. I remained in my chair, watching the beautiful destruction with the satisfaction of someone who'd waited 3 years for this moment. But as I looked at my son, alive, scarred, harder than the man who'd disappeared, I realized I had no idea what he'd become during those missing years. The Michael I'd known was gentle, diplomatic, someone who resolved conflicts with conversation rather than confrontation. This man looked like he'd learned different methods of problem solving. My son was home, but I wasn't entirely certain I knew who he was anymore. And judging by the look in his eyes, that might be exactly what Sabrina and Richard deserved. Michael found me in the hotel bar 2 hours after the gala transformed into chaos. The ballroom had emptied like someone had announced a fire, leaving behind abandoned champagne and numerous uncomfortable questions. "Hello, Mom." I looked up from my wine to see my son standing there like he'd returned from a business trip instead of the dead. He looked exhausted, older, but alive in a way that made my chest tight with relief I couldn't yet express. "You're late for dinner," I said. "About 3 years late." He sat across from me and ordered whiskey, which was new. The Michael I remembered preferred beer and occasional wine. "I got delayed," he said. For 30 minutes, he told me a story that made every thriller novel seem like children's literature. The car accident had been real, but not accidental. Richard's associates had sabotaged his brakes on that mountain road, intending to make it appear he'd lost control in severe weather. Michael had managed to escape before the car went over, but barely. "2 guys were waiting," he said, staring into his whiskey like it might contain answers. "Professional guys, the kind who get paid to make problems disappear. They'd taken him to a warehouse in Nevada, where he'd spent 6 weeks blindfolded and restrained, while Richard and Sabrina told everyone he was dead. The plan was straightforward: wait for the insurance money to clear, then dispose of the only person who could expose their money laundering operation. But they needed my passwords, Michael continued, my access codes, client information, all the details that would make the transition appear legitimate. So they kept me alive long enough to be useful. He'd cooperated partially, providing bits of information while secretly planning escape. When they relocated him to a second facility, a cabin in Colorado, where he had more freedom but constant surveillance, he'd finally found his opportunity after 3 months. "I killed one of the guards," he said quietly, "with a kitchen knife. I'd never killed anyone before." The casual way he said it revealed more about the past 3 years than any detailed explanation could have. After that, it was over 2 years of staying invisible. False identity, cash jobs, sleeping in different places every few nights. I spent the first year just surviving, learning how to disappear completely. The second year, I started planning my return. But you accessed your computer files. He smiled for the first time since sitting down. You got Angela to send that email. Clever. I'd been watching the company's systems for months, but I couldn't risk direct contact until I was certain you were investigating too. The anonymous emails? Insurance. I needed to know if you'd found my evidence before I revealed myself. If you'd stopped looking, I would have handled things differently. By differently, I suspected he meant more violently. I've been watching Sabrina and Richard for 2 years, he said, learning their routines, their contacts, their weaknesses, but I needed them to feel completely secure before I made my move. And tonight was their victory celebration, the perfect moment to remind them that dead men tell no tales, but living ones can destroy everything they've built. He reached across the table and squeezed my hand. Thank you, Mom, for believing I was alive when everyone else accepted I was dead, for not giving up. I squeezed back, feeling the calluses on his hands that hadn't been there before. Your room was never going anywhere, and neither was I. But looking at him now, I realized how much had changed. This wasn't the same person who'd disappeared 3 years ago. This man had harder edges, colder calculations behind his eyes. What happens now? I asked. Now we finish what they started. But Mom, he looked directly at me. I need your help. I've been gathering evidence for 2 years, but it's scattered, hidden in different places. I need someone they trust to help me get close enough to collect everything we need for the FBI. They don't trust me. They think you're harmless. That's different, but it's enough. His expression grew more serious. This is going to be dangerous. Once they realize I'm alive, they'll try to eliminate both of us. Are you prepared for that? I thought about 3 years of grief, rage, and careful planning, about watching Sabrina profit from my son's supposed death while I played the grateful mother-in-law. I've been preparing for 3 years, I said. Michael smiled, and for a moment I saw the son I remembered beneath the scarred stranger. Then let's remind them why they should have made sure I stayed dead. Outside the hotel, news vans were already gathering. By morning, Michael Monroe's resurrection would dominate headlines across 3 states. But tonight, in a quiet hotel bar, a mother and son were planning to finish a war that had started 3 years ago. Time to collect every gram of pain, I said, raising my glass. Michael clinked his whiskey against my wine. With compound interest. We had less than 24 hours before Richard and Sabrina recovered from their shock and either fled the country or tried to eliminate the inconvenient resurrection of Michael Monroe. They'll run, Michael said over breakfast in my kitchen the next morning. Richard's too smart to try violence now that I'm public, but they'll destroy evidence first. What evidence do we need? He pulled out a notebook filled with 2 years of careful observations. Financial records proving the money laundering, communication logs between Richard and his criminal contacts, documentation of the kidnapping and murder plot. Where is all of this? Scattered. Some's in Sabrina's home safe, some's in Richard's office, some's in offshore accounts they think I can't access. He looked at me seriously. I need you to get me into places I can't go without raising suspicion. That's when Angela called, panic in her voice. Mrs. Monroe, you need to know, Richard's at the office right now. He's been here since 6 a.m., shredding documents and wiping computer drives. And Sabrina? She paused. Sabrina's been calling airline companies. On my way, I said, grabbing my keys. Mom, wait. Michael caught my arm. I've already contacted the FBI. Agent Sarah Chen is coordinating with local police. They're positioned around Richard's building, but they need probable cause to enter. What kind of probable cause? The kind that happens when someone threatens a federal witness. He handed me a small recording device. I need you to get Richard to admit something, anything, about the kidnapping or money laundering. The moment he threatens you or confesses to a crime, the FBI moves in. And if he doesn't cooperate? Michael's expression grew harder. Then you leave immediately and call 911. I won't lose you too. How will they know when to come in? I'll be watching from the van across the street. The device transmits live audio to the FBI. The moment you're in danger, they move. An hour later, I was sitting in Richard's office, playing the confused mother-in-law while he tried to appear normal, despite having spent the morning destroying evidence. Elizabeth, I'm so sorry about last night, Richard said, sweat beading on his forehead, despite the air conditioning. That must have been such a shock. Shock doesn't begin to cover it, I replied truthfully. I'm still not entirely convinced I didn't hallucinate the whole thing. I can understand that. Grief can play terrible tricks on the mind. I watched him fidget with papers, checking his phone every few minutes. Through the window, I could see the van Michael had mentioned, along with what I now realized were unmarked police cars positioned strategically around the building. "Richard, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be honest with me." He went very still. "Of course. Did you and Sabrina know Michael was alive?" "What? No. How could we possibly? Because if you did, and you let me grieve for 3 years while you knew he was alive somewhere," I let my voice break slightly. "I don't know how I could forgive that." Richard's phone buzzed. He glanced at it. And his face went pale. I caught a glimpse of the screen. "Documents secured. Leave now. Elizabeth, I think you should go home now." "Why? What's wrong?" He was already standing, moving toward his desk drawer. "Nothing's wrong. I just think..." That's when his computer chimed with an alert notification. Someone had accessed his system remotely. Richard lunged for his laptop, but I was closer. Without thinking, I grabbed the computer and held it against my chest. "Give me that," Richard demanded, his mask of sympathy completely gone. "Why? What's on here that you don't want me to see?" "Elizabeth, you don't understand what you're getting involved in." "Then explain it to me." Richard opened his desk drawer and pulled out a gun. I stared at the weapon, my mind suddenly crystal clear. This wasn't grief counseling anymore. This was life and death. "Put the computer down, Elizabeth. Or what? You'll shoot me? In your office? In broad daylight?" "If I have to." "You don't understand. We had no choice. Michael was going to destroy everything we'd built. My recording device was capturing every word." "So, you had him kidnapped?" "We had him removed from the equation. He would have ruined us all. And you've been stealing from his company ever since. We've been protecting what should have been ours from the beginning." My phone rang. Michael's voice came through the speaker, calm and clear. "That's enough confession for one day, Richard. FBI, you're clear to enter." Richard spun toward the phone, gun still pointed at me. "Michael?" His voice cracked. "Where are you?" "Close enough to watch you threaten my mother. Close enough to record everything you just said." The office door burst open. 2 FBI agents entered with weapons drawn, followed by Michael and what appeared to be half the federal law enforcement apparatus. Richard dropped his gun like it was on fire. "Richard Dalton," Agent Chen announced. "You're under arrest for conspiracy, money laundering, kidnapping, and attempted murder." As they handcuffed him, Richard looked at me with something like respect. "You never were harmless, were you, Elizabeth?" "Not even a little bit," I replied. Michael crossed the room and pulled me into a hug that felt like coming home after 3 years of being lost. "Good work, Mom," he whispered. "They got everything they need." Outside, I could see Sabrina being arrested at her house, news crews already gathering to document the spectacular collapse of her stolen empire. "Is it over?" I asked. Michael smiled. "The dangerous part is, the satisfying part is just beginning." He was right. Watching them get arrested was just the appetizer. The main course would be watching them lose everything they'd stolen while the world learned exactly what they'd done to my family. Justice, apparently, was best served with maximum publicity and no possibility of parole. The FBI initially treated Michael like a suspect rather than a victim, which was both frustrating and entirely predictable. Agent Sarah Chen made it clear that people who fake their own deaths, even under duress, create complicated legal situations. "Mr. Monroe, you understand that disappearing for 3 years while your wife collected life insurance creates certain concerns about your credibility." We sat in an FBI conference room that smelled like burnt coffee and institutional disinfectant. Michael faced a panel of agents who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. "Agent Chen," I interrupted, "my son was kidnapped and held against his will. He escaped and spent 2 years gathering evidence against his kidnappers. How exactly does that make him a criminal?" "Mrs. Monroe, we appreciate your concern, but we need to verify Mr. Monroe's story independently. The evidence he's provided is extensive, but we need to confirm it wasn't fabricated." For 3 weeks, Michael submitted to polygraph tests, psychiatric evaluations, and detailed interrogations about every aspect of his captivity and evidence gathering. The FBI verified his story through forensic analysis of the locations he'd described, interviews with witnesses, and technical examination of the financial records he'd collected. "The evidence you've provided is extensive," Agent Chen finally admitted. "Financial records, recorded conversations, documentation of illegal transactions. But we had to be absolutely certain of its authenticity before proceeding. And now you are?" "Now we are. The forensic accounting alone proves systematic money laundering on a massive scale. Combined with the recorded confessions and physical evidence from the kidnapping sites," she nodded grimly, "we have enough to convict everyone involved." The investigation took 6 weeks. 6 weeks of Michael explaining his captivity, escape, and evidence gathering to lawyers, prosecutors, and agents who seemed amazed that someone could survive what he'd endured. The media loved the story, naturally. Kidnapped CEO returns from the dead to expose corporate conspiracy was the kind of headline that drove web traffic and television ratings. Sabrina's perp walk played on every news channel for 3 days. The image of her in handcuffs, wearing an orange jumpsuit that clashed spectacularly with her complexion, became the defining photograph of the scandal. Richard tried to cooperate, offering to testify against his criminal contacts in exchange for a reduced sentence. The prosecutor's response was polite but firm. They had enough evidence to convict everyone involved without deals. The trial began 6 months later and lasted 8 weeks. I attended every day, sitting in the same seat in the 3rd row, watching Sabrina and Richard face the consequences of thinking they were smarter than everyone else. The prosecution built their case methodically, phone records showing coordination between Sabrina and Richard before Michael's disappearance, financial documents proving systematic theft from Monroe Innovations, security footage of Richard meeting with known criminals. But the moment that destroyed their defense was when prosecutors played Richard's recorded voice discussing permanent solutions to temporary problems while Michael sat at the witness table, very much alive and ready to testify. Michael's testimony lasted 2 days. He walked the jury through his kidnapping and imprisonment with the calm precision of someone who'd rehearsed the story until it no longer caused pain. "They kept me alive because they needed information," he explained. "Passwords, client contacts, details about company operations. They told me that once they had what they needed, I'd be released." "Did you believe them?" the prosecutor asked. "No. I'd heard them discussing what they called cleanup procedures. I knew they planned to kill me once I was no longer useful." Sabrina's attorney attempted to portray her as a victim of her father's influence, but the recorded conversations made that difficult. It's challenging to claim innocence when a jury has heard you planning someone's murder in your own voice. The verdict came back on a Thursday afternoon. Guilty on all counts for both defendants. Richard received 25 years to life. Sabrina got 20 years to life, with possibility of parole in 18 years if she maintained good behavior. Given her track record, good behavior seemed optimistic. The courtroom was packed for sentencing. Michael sat beside me, wearing the same suit he'd worn to his father's funeral. Justice, apparently, required formal attire. "Mrs. Monroe," the Channel 7 reporter caught me outside the courthouse. "How does it feel to see your son's attackers brought to justice?" I looked directly into the camera. "Justice isn't something you feel," I said. "It's something you do. And today, we did it properly." The civil judgments followed a month later. Richard and Sabrina were ordered to repay everything they'd stolen, plus damages, plus legal fees. Their assets were seized and liquidated to cover the debt. Sabrina's beautiful house went to a young family with 3 children who filled it with laughter and chaos. Richard's consulting business was dissolved, proceeds distributed to victim compensation funds. Monroe Innovations thrived under employee ownership. Angela became head of operations, Tyler advanced to strategic development, and the company grew in ways that had nothing to do with money laundering or criminal partnerships. But the most satisfying moment came 3 months after sentencing, when I received a letter from Sabrina's prison. She was seeking forgiveness, claiming she'd found religion and wanted to make amends. I read it twice, then filed it in my kitchen trash can. Some actions are beyond forgiveness. Some betrayals are too complete to repair, and some people deserve exactly what they receive. The best part, I told Michael over dinner that evening, is that they'll have 20 years to think about what they lost. Everything, he said. Everything they stole. Everything they thought they'd gained. Everything they thought they deserved. Michael raised his glass. To justice served with interest, and to the realization that Elizabeth Monroe is not someone you want as an enemy. Outside my kitchen window, I could see children playing in the yard where Sabrina used to plan her next acquisition, safe and protected and unaware that monsters sometimes wear familiar faces. But they were growing up in a world where people like Michael and me had proven that monsters could be defeated. That felt like victory enough. The months following the trial were a strange combination of closure and new beginnings. Michael needed time to readjust to a life that wasn't defined by survival and revenge. I needed time to figure out what Elizabeth Monroe looked like when she wasn't investigating corporate conspiracy. We both discovered that justice, while satisfying, leaves you with the question, now what? The answer came in the form of a phone call from a woman in Oregon whose husband had vanished under suspicious circumstances. She'd heard about our case and wondered if we might have advice for someone dealing with police who seemed more interested in closing cases than solving them. That conversation led to another, then another. Within 6 months, Michael and I realized we'd accidentally created an informal support network for families dealing with suspicious disappearances. 2 years after the trial ended, I was sitting in my new office on the 20th floor of the Monroe Foundation building, looking out at a city that had learned not to underestimate Elizabeth Monroe. At 70 years old, I'd discovered that survival doesn't just make you stronger, it makes you useful. Michael had been correct about preferring the nonprofit sector. The Monroe Foundation for Missing Persons had grown from a one-person operation to a nationally recognized organization that had helped locate over 200 missing persons and provided support to thousands of families dealing with kidnapping and forced disappearance. The irony wasn't lost on anyone that the woman who'd lost her son had become the person other families called when they needed someone found. Angela ran the foundation's daily operations with the efficiency of someone who understood that other people's emergencies were our routine. Tyler had surprised everyone by becoming a gifted public speaker, traveling to law enforcement conferences and teaching officers how to recognize signs of corporate-connected kidnapping. "Mrs. Monroe," Angela knocked on my office door, "the documentary crew is here for your final interview." The PBS special about the Monroe case had been in production for 8 months. When Dead Men Return was scheduled to air next month, precisely 5 years after Michael's dramatic resurrection. I'd agreed to participate reluctantly, but Michael had convinced me that our story might help other families recognize warning signs they might otherwise miss. "Send them in," I said, checking my reflection in the window. At 70, I'd learned that appearing competent was half the battle in any situation. The interviewer was a serious young woman who'd done her research thoroughly. She asked intelligent questions about the investigation, the trial, and the aftermath. But what she really wanted to understand was how it felt to discover that your family contained people capable of murder. "Betrayal changes you," I told her. "It makes you more careful about trust, but also more appreciative of people who earn it." "Do you think about them, Sabrina and Richard?" "Sometimes, usually when I'm reading about other families experiencing similar situations. Their story has become a cautionary tale about the dangers of assuming you know the people closest to you." "Any regrets?" I considered that question carefully. "I regret that my son suffered for 3 years. I regret that people we trusted turned out to be criminals. But I don't regret fighting back. Sometimes the only choice you have is between being a victim and being a survivor." After the interview, I walked down to Michael's office on the 15th floor. He was reviewing case files, looking older but more settled than the corporate executive who'd disappeared 5 years earlier. "How did it go?" he asked. "They'll portray us as appropriately heroic and righteously vindicated. The usual narrative." He laughed. "Could be worse. They could make us look incompetent. Impossible. We won." Michael had remarried the previous year. Sarah was a fellow survivor advocate who understood that some conversations happened in darkness and some victories came with permanent scars. They were discussing children, which would make me a grandmother and complete the circle of renewal that had begun with his return from the dead. "Dinner Sunday?" he asked. "Sarah's making that roast you like. Wouldn't miss it." As I drove home that evening, I passed the building that had once housed Richard's consulting business. It was now a coffee shop run by a retired teacher who made excellent scones and knew nothing about money laundering. The house where Sabrina had performed Grieving Widow was occupied by a young family whose biggest drama involved getting 3 children ready for school each morning. I'd driven past it once, shortly after the trial, and been pleased to see toys in the yard and lights in every window. Some spaces recover from evil, others have to be completely transformed. My own house looked exactly as it had 5 years ago, except for the security system and safe room Michael had insisted on installing. Just because the immediate threat was neutralized didn't mean we'd forgotten lessons about being prepared. I poured myself wine and stood in my kitchen, looking at photographs covering my refrigerator, Michael at his wedding, Angela receiving the Foundation's Employee of the Year award, Tyler speaking at a national conference, me shaking hands with a senator who'd sponsored legislation inspired by Michael's case. Evidence of a life rebuilt after catastrophic damage. The PBS documentary would probably focus on the drama of the trial and the satisfaction of seeing justice served. But the real story was simpler and more complex. how you continue when the worst imaginable thing happens to someone you love. The answer, it turned out, was that you don't just continue. You get stronger, you get smarter, you get more careful about trust, and more ruthless about protecting what matters. I finished my wine and studied my face in the dark window glass. The woman looking back had gray hair and laugh lines, and the kind of confidence that comes from surviving your own personal apocalypse. I was 70 years old, had a successful foundation, and my son was safely home where he belonged, I said to that reflection. What more could I ask for? The answer was nothing. After 5 years of building something meaningful from the wreckage of betrayal, I had everything that mattered. And if Sabrina was watching the news from her prison cell, she'd see that the family she'd tried to destroy had not only survived but flourished. Sometimes the best revenge is living well, but sometimes the best revenge is living well while your enemies serve 20 to life in federal prison. I preferred the latter option. What I learned, I murmured to the empty kitchen, rehearsing for future interviews. That revenge is like a fine wine. It's worth waiting for the perfect vintage. The Foundation's latest newsletter sat on my counter, featuring a story about a family reunion made possible by our missing persons database. 12 people safely home because we'd learned how to fight back against the kind of evil that had tried to erase my son. That felt like victory. That felt like justice. That felt like enough. Michael was right about some chapters needing to stay closed, but others were just beginning, and the best ones were written by people who refused to let villains have the last word. I raised my empty wine glass toward the window and toasted the life we'd rebuilt from scratch. Here's to new beginnings, I said, and to old enemies who learned what happens when you mess with the wrong family. Outside, the city lights twinkled like stars, full of other families with their own stories of survival and renewal. And somewhere in that city, people who needed help would find our number, call our office, and discover that they weren't alone in their fight against people who thought they could make inconvenient family members disappear. We'd proven that wrong once. We'd prove it wrong as many times as necessary. That was the Monroe family legacy now. Not corporate success or financial achievement, but the knowledge that some things are worth fighting for, and some fights are worth winning, no matter how long they take. I turned off the kitchen light and headed upstairs, already planning tomorrow's work. The Foundation had cases to solve, families to reunite, and justice to serve. Just another day in the life of a woman who discovered that the best way to honor the dead was to fight relentlessly for the living. And if that wasn't a happy ending, it was something better, a purposeful one. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and feel free to share your story in the comments. Your voice matters.